Dakota Territory, 1895. At the dusty, dry Willow Station, passengers mock a stranded woman whose brother's death has left her penniless and alone. Edith Mayhew, 59 and full-figured, clutches her trunk of fabrics, while cruel laughter echoes around her. Then Jonas Pike, a weathered cowboy with empty pockets but a full heart, steps through the crowd. He's 54, owns nothing but his horse, and came seeking wages that might never come. Yet something in his late mother's words stirs him. Loneliness is the cruelest winter. What he does next changes both their lives forever. Jonas declares Edith under his protection and offers her passage to his ranch, promising honest work and shelter. The townspeople whisper he's taken a bride sight unseen, but neither Jonas nor Edith expected what would bloom between two souls who thought love had passed them by. But when nature itself threatens to destroy everything they've built, will their unlikely partnership survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of dry Willow Station as Jonas Pike adjusted his worn hat and studied the departure board. 3 trains delayed, 2 cancelled outright. The brass fittings had long since tarnished, and someone had scratched "Hope Dies Here" into the wood beneath the schedule. Jonas had ridden 23 miles through Dakota Territory's unforgiving landscape for wages that might exist only in his employer's promises. But a man didn't survive 54 years by abandoning hope at the first sign of trouble. His calloused hands bore testimony to 3 decades of honest labor rope, burns from cattle drives, scars from barbed wire, the permanent stain of leather dye under his fingernails. Jonas Pike had never owned much beyond his horse, his saddle, and his word, but those had been enough to earn respect from ranch hands and ranchers alike. His mother, God rest her soul, had raised him to believe that a man's character mattered more than his bank account. "Treat folks decent, Jonas," she'd whispered during her final winter, "and the Lord will see you through the lean times." The lean times had stretched into lean decades. Jonas removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through graying hair that refused to lie flat despite his best efforts. His reflection in the station window showed a face carved by wind and worry, brown eyes that had seen too much hardship but retained their kindness. Women had shown interest over the years, widows mostly, seeking security more than affection, but Jonas had never found the courage to court seriously. What did he have to offer beyond strong hands and an honest heart? The commotion near the eastbound platform drew his attention like iron filings to a magnet. A crowd had gathered around a woman seated on a battered trunk, her dark dress marking her as recently bereaved. Jonas couldn't make out her features from this distance, but her posture spoke of defeat, shoulders curved inward, head bowed beneath a simple black bonnet. The crowd's laughter carried cruelty that made his stomach clench with recognition. "Look at the size of her," one passenger snickered to his companion. "Poor thing's been eating for 2 all her life. Brother probably died just to escape supporting her appetite," another voice chimed in, drawing more laughter. Jonas had heard such talk before, directed at anyone who didn't fit society's narrow mold of acceptability. As a boy, he'd endured similar cruelty for his patched clothes and empty belly. The memory of that helplessness still burned in his chest like swallowed coals. Moving closer, Jonas observed the woman more carefully. She appeared to be near his own age, perhaps a few years older, with silver threading through brown hair that had been carefully arranged despite her obvious distress. Her hands, folded primly in her lap, showed the telltale marks of skilled needlework, tiny pinprick scars, and the slight callus that developed from years of precise stitching. A seamstress or dressmaker, he guessed, noting the quality of her mourning dress despite its simple cut. Her trunk bore brass corners and sturdy construction, the kind made to protect valuable contents during long journeys. Fabric samples peeked from beneath the partially opened lid, silks and woolens in colors that spoke of better times. This woman had possessed means once, perhaps even prosperity, before whatever circumstances brought her to this dusty platform, with tears threatening to spill from eyes the color of autumn leaves. "Edith Mayhew," the station master called out, consulting his clipboard with bureaucratic indifference. "No funds for eastbound passage. You'll need to wire family for money or find alternative arrangements." The woman Edith lifted her chin with dignity that made Jonas's heart squeeze with admiration. "I've explained my situation, sir. My brother passed last week. There is no family to wire." "Then I suggest you consider the charitable society in town," the station master replied, already turning away. "This platform is for paying passengers only." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone suggested she might find work in the saloons, drawing scandalized gasps and renewed mockery. Jonas watched Edith's hands tremble slightly as she smoothed her skirts, her composure beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of public humiliation. His mother's voice echoed across the years. "Loneliness is the cruelest winter, Jonas. Don't let it freeze the kindness from your heart." Jonas Pike had never been one for grand gestures or pretty speeches. He'd learned early that actions carried more weight than words, that a man's character showed clearest when nobody was watching. But sometimes, watching was exactly what mattered most. Sometimes, standing up meant standing out, regardless of personal cost. He stepped forward, his boot heels clicking against the wooden platform with quiet authority. The crowd's chatter faded as Jonas approached, his presence commanding attention without demand. He'd learned this from years of handling spooked cattle, and nervous horses' confidence communicated itself through posture and breath long before words entered the equation. "Ma'am," Jonas said, removing his hat and offering Edith a respectful nod. "Jonas Pike, from Willow Bend Ranch. I couldn't help overhearing your difficulties." Edith looked up, surprise replacing despair in her brown eyes. Up close, Jonas could see the fine lines that spoke of laughter alongside sorrow, the gentle curve of lips that had likely offered comfort to others during their own dark hours. She possessed the kind of beauty that deepened with time and the flashy prettiness that faded with youth, but the enduring attractiveness of a woman who'd learned to find joy despite life's disappointments. "Mr. Pike," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd received proper education. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with your ranch." 20 miles west of here," Jonas explained, acutely aware of the crowd's attention. "I came to town on business, but I find myself in need of assistance as much as you might be." This wasn't entirely true. Jonas had hoped to collect wages, not hire help, but sometimes truth bent itself around larger principles. His mother had taught him that lies, told in service of kindness, carried different weight than those spoken for selfish gain. "I'm not certain I understand," Edith said carefully. Jonas knelt beside her trunk, bringing himself to her eye level despite the impropriety. "Ma'am, I can see you're a woman of skill and refinement. My ranch is small, and I live simply, but I could offer honest work and fair compensation. Cooking, mending, perhaps help with correspondence. I'm not much for letters myself." The admission cost him pride, but Jonas had learned that vulnerability often opened doors that force could never budge. Around them, the crowd grew quiet, sensing drama unfolding. "Mr. Pike," Edith began, uncertainty wavering in her voice, "I appreciate your kindness, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Ma'am," Jonas interrupted gently, "my mother always said that loneliness was the cruelest winter. I've been facing that winter alone for more years than I care to count. If you'd consider coming to Willow Bend, you'd be doing me the favor." Edith studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read character in subtle details. Jonas met her gaze steadily, allowing her to see whatever truth she sought. He'd never been skilled at deception anyway. His face revealed his thoughts as clearly as prairie weather revealed approaching storms. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Pike?" she asked quietly. "Honest work for honest pay," Jonas replied. "A room of your own, meals and whatever wage we can agree upon. Nothing more than that, I give you my word." The station master cleared his throat impatiently. "Ma'am, if you're not purchasing passage, you'll need to clear the platform." Jonas stood, his full height and broad shoulders creating a barrier between Edith and the officious little man. "The lady needs time to consider her options." "And who might you be to make demands?" the station master challenged. "A man with business in town," Jonas replied evenly, "and friends at the bank who might be interested to hear how their customers are treated at this station." It was mostly bluff. Jonas's relationship with the bank involved more debt than friendship, but his steady tone carried conviction. The station master stepped back, suddenly discovering urgent paperwork that required his immediate attention. Jonas returned his focus to Edith, who had been watching this exchange with growing interest. "Ma'am, I won't pretend this is charity dressed up as employment. I genuinely could use help around the ranch, but I also won't pretend I'm not moved by your situation. Sometimes the right thing and the practical thing align themselves, and a wise person doesn't question such fortune." Edith was quiet for a long moment, her gaze shifting between Jonas's face and the departing crowd. The eastbound train's whistle echoed in the distance, carrying with it her last easy path back to familiar territory. "Mr. Pike," she said finally, "I believe I would like to accept your offer." Relief flooded through Jonas like cool water after a long drought. "I'm glad to hear it, ma'am. Shall we see about getting your trunk loaded?" As Jonas hefted Edith's trunk heavier than expected, packed with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to making every possession, Counthy caught fragments of whispered conversation from the remaining passengers. "Took himself a mail-order bride sight unseen," one woman murmured to her companion. "Poor man probably couldn't get a woman any other way," came the reply. Jonas's jaw tightened, but Edith placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let them talk, Mr. Pike. Words can't hurt us if we don't give them permission." Her wisdom impressed him. Most people responded to cruelty with anger or tears, but Edith had found a third pathos that preserved dignity while acknowledging reality. Jonas secured her trunk in his wagon bed, taking care to position it where the rough roads wouldn't damage whatever treasures lay inside. "Mrs. Mayhew," he began, then paused. "I'm sorry, I should have asked, is it Mrs. or Miss?" "Miss," Edith replied, settling herself on the wagon seat with careful attention to her skirts. "I never married Mr. Pike. I lived with my brother Harold and kept house for him after our parents passed. He was particular about respectability." Jonas heard volumes in what she didn't say. A brother particular about respectability might well have discouraged suitors, especially for a sister whose figure didn't conform to fashionable ideals. Such men often preferred keeping their sisters as unpaid housekeepers rather than losing their services to marriage. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jonas said, taking up the reins. "Losing family is never easy." "Thank you." Edith adjusted her bonnet against the afternoon sun. Harold was a good man in his way, but he worried overmuch about what people thought. I believe he forgot sometimes that living and appearing to live properly aren't always the same thing. As they rolled away from Dry Willow Station, Jonas found himself stealing glances at his passenger. Edith sat straight-backed but relaxed, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the uncertainty of her situation. She possessed the kind of composure that came from years of managing household crises and social difficulties with grace. "Tell me about your ranch, Mr. Pike," she said as the town's buildings gave way to open prairie. "What sort of operation do you run?" Jonas appreciated her directness. Too many people danced around important questions, preferring comfortable lies to useful truths. "It's modest," he admitted. "Cattle mostly, some horses. I run about 50 head on 800 acres, though I only own half that outright. The rest I lease from the territorial government." "And your household?" "Just me and 3 hands good men, but not much for domestic comforts. We've been making do with our own cooking and mending, which explains why we're all too thin and our clothes are more patch than original fabric." Edith smiled, and Jonas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "I take it you're hoping I might improve that situation." "I'm hoping you might consider it," Jonas replied carefully, "but I want you to understand the conditions clearly. The ranch house is small and simple. Your room would be private, with a good lock on the door, but the accommodations are far from luxurious. We rise early and work hard, and entertainment consists mainly of reading by lamplight and conversation around the evening fire. Mr. Pike, I've spent the last 15 years managing my brother's household on a schoolteacher's salary. Simple living doesn't frighten me, and hard work never killed anyone worth knowing. Jonas nodded approvingly. What about the isolation? Willow Bend isn't exactly a social hub, and we're 20 miles from the nearest neighbor with a telephone. After Harold's funeral, I discovered that most of what I thought was social connection was really just obligation disguised as friendship. True companionship has always been rare in my experience. Edith paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. Besides, I've always found that interesting people create their own entertainment, while boring people remain bored, regardless of their surroundings. The observation showed an intelligence that Jonas found both attractive and slightly intimidating. Edith clearly possessed education and refinement that his rough upbringing had never provided. Yet she'd chosen to trust him, a virtual stranger, with her future. The responsibility of that trust settled on his shoulders like a familiar weight. What about you, Mr. Pike? What should I know about the man who's offered me this opportunity? Jonas considered the question carefully. Most people asked about his past when they wanted to judge his worthiness, but Edith's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than evaluation. I'm 54 years old, never married, and I've been working ranches since I was 12. He began. My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both in the same winter. I was raised by whoever would take me in, learning ranch work in exchange for food and shelter. That must have been difficult. It taught me to value kindness when I found it, Jonas replied, and to recognize the difference between people who help because they're good and people who help because they want something in return. And which am I? Edith asked quietly. Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to face her fully. Miss Mayhew, I believe you're someone who's known both kindness and cruelty and chosen to respond with kindness yourself. That's rarer than most people realize. Edith's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. Mr. Pike, I think this arrangement may benefit us both more than either of us expected. As they resumed their journey toward Willow Bend, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in years' anticipation for the future. The afternoon sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the beauty of the landscape didn't emphasize his loneliness. Instead, it seemed to promise new beginnings. One more question, if I may, Edith said as they topped a rise that revealed the distant buildings of Willow Bend Ranch. What made you step forward at the station? You could have walked away like everyone else. Jonas was quiet for a moment, searching for words that would convey truth without sounding foolish. My mother used to say that we're all just walking each other home. Some folks get lost along the way, and they need someone to help them find their path again. He met Edith's gaze. I reckon I've been lost for a while myself. Then perhaps, Edith said softly, we can help each other find the way. The simple words carried more hope than Jonas had allowed himself to feel in decades. As Willow Bend Ranch came into view, small, weathered, but honest in its simplicity, he wondered if this unexpected woman might be the answer to prayers he'd been too proud to voice. The future stretched ahead like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that neither of them could have imagined when the day began. Behind them, the sun continued its westward journey, painting their shadows long across the prairie grass. Ahead, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a tiny promise that even in the vast loneliness of the frontier, light could still find its way through the darkness. The first light of dawn crept through the small window of Edith's room, illuminating walls that had been scrubbed clean but couldn't hide their humble nature. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, fully dressed despite the early hour, her hands folded around a worn leather Bible that had belonged to Jonas's mother. He'd offered it to her the night before, along with a hesitant explanation of how his mother had pressed flowers between its pages and filled the margins with notes about kindness and Christian duty. She always said the good book was meant to be lived, not just read. Jonas had explained. his calloused fingers tracing the Bible's cracked spine with reverence. Maybe you'd find comfort in her words. Now, as morning light revealed the pressed violets and wild roses scattered throughout the pages, Edith felt a connection to the woman who had raised Jonas to be the kind of man who would rescue strangers at train stations. The handwritten notes spoke of a faith tested by hardship, but never broken observations about finding grace in small moments and treating every person as worthy of dignity. A soft knock interrupted her reading. "Miss Mayhew? Breakfast is ready when you are." Jonas's voice carried the same careful respect it had held since her arrival 3 days ago. He seemed determined to maintain proper boundaries, addressing her formally and ensuring she never felt pressured or uncomfortable. The consideration touched her deeply, especially after years of her brother's brusque dismissal of social niceties. "I'll be right there, Mr. Pike." Edith closed the Bible carefully and placed it on the small table Jonas had provided for her personal items. The room was sparse but clean, with a washstand, a chair, and hooks on the wall for her dresses. Someone Jonas, she suspected, had hung simple curtains at the window and placed a small vase of prairie flowers on the windowsill. The gestures spoke of a thoughtfulness that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The main room of the ranch house served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one. Jonas stood at the stove, his movements economical as he tended to bacon and eggs. The coffee pot sent steam curling toward the ceiling, and fresh biscuits cooled on a plate near the window. For a man who claimed to have little skill in domestic matters, he'd managed to prepare a meal that looked both appetizing and substantial. "Good morning," Edith said, smoothing her skirts as she took the chair Jonas indicated. "Something smells wonderful." "Don't set your expectations too high," Jonas replied with a self-deprecating smile. "I can manage the basics, but I'm no chef." As they ate, Edith found herself studying Jonas's hands as he handled his coffee cup. They were large and scarred, with permanent stains from rope and leather, but they moved with surprising gentleness. These were hands that had learned to calm spooked horses and birth difficult calves, hands that had built this modest home board by board through sheer determination. "Mr. Pike," she began carefully, "I've been thinking about our arrangement, and I wonder if you might allow me to examine your account books today. You mentioned yesterday that paperwork wasn't your strongest skill." Jonas paused with his coffee halfway to his lips. A flush crept up his neck, and he set the cup down with deliberate care. "Miss Mayhew, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure that's necessary." "I don't mean to overstep," Edith interrupted gently. "It's simply that I managed my brother's household accounts for 15 years, and I have some experience with business correspondence. If I'm to earn my keep here, I'd like to contribute in whatever way might be most helpful." The admission clearly cost Jonas pride, but after a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. "The truth is, I could use the help. Numbers and letters have never come easy to me, and I'm always worried I'm missing something important." After breakfast, Jonas led Edith to a corner of the main room where a battered desk held stacks of papers in various states of organization. Bills, receipts, and correspondence lay scattered across the surface like leaves after a windstorm. A ledger book sat open to a page, covered with Jonas's careful but labored handwriting, each entry representing hours of struggle with unfamiliar symbols. "I know it's a mess," Jonas said, embarrassment clear in his voice. "I try to keep track of everything, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing more harm than good." Edith pulled up a chair and began sorting through the papers with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to bringing order from chaos. As she worked, a troubling picture began to emerge. The ranch was barely breaking even, with expenses consistently outpacing income. Creditors had been patient so far, but several recent letters carried increasingly urgent tones. "Mr. Pike," she said carefully, "when did you last review these accounts in detail?" "I look at them regular," Jonas replied, though his tone suggested he knew that wasn't the same thing. "Every month or so, I add up what's come in and what's gone out." "And the letters from the bank? Have you responded to their recent correspondence?" Jonas's silence was answer enough. Edith picked up the most recent letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, and read it with growing concern. The bank was calling in a loan that Jonas had apparently been struggling to service for months. The payment schedule had been restructured twice already, and their patience was clearly exhausted. "Mr. Pike, this letter indicates that you have 30 days to bring your account current or face foreclosure proceedings." The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. He sank into the chair across from Edith, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "I knew things were tight, but I didn't realize I can't read all the fancy legal words they use." Edith's heart ached for the pride and shame warring in his expression. Here was a man who had offered her shelter and employment when his own situation was desperately precarious. The generosity of the gesture, now that she understood the context, left her speechless. "How much do you owe?" she asked quietly. Jonas pulled out a crumpled paper from his shirt pocket, the loan document he'd been carrying like a lead weight. $800, plus interest. "I borrowed it 3 years ago to buy additional cattle, thinking I could build up the herd and pay it back easy. Then the drought hit, and cattle prices dropped, and—" he spread his hands helplessly. $800. To Edith, it represented a fortune beyond imagining. To Jonas, it clearly represented the difference between keeping his life's work and losing everything he'd built through decades of backbreaking labor. "What about your livestock? Could you sell some cattle to raise the money? Market's still depressed from the drought. I'd be lucky to get half what they're worth, and I'd need to keep most of the herd to have any hope of rebuilding." Jonas rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking something will turn up, some way to make it work, but time's running short." Edith set down the bank letter and looked directly at Jonas. "Why didn't you tell me about this before offering me employment? You could hardly afford to take on additional expenses." "Because," Jonas started, then stopped, struggling to find words for feelings that ran deeper than practical considerations. "Because a man has to live with himself, Miss Mayhew. I've made my share of mistakes, but I won't add turning my back on someone in need to that list. Whatever happens with the ranch, at least I'll know I did right by you." The simple dignity of his response brought tears to Edith's eyes. She'd lived her entire adult life with a brother who calculated every gesture in terms of social advantage or financial benefit. To discover a man who would risk his own security for the sake of helping a stranger felt like finding water in a desert. "Mr. Pike, Jonas, there has to be something we can do." "We?" Jonas looked up sharply. "Miss Mayhew, this isn't your problem to solve. I brought you here to give you work, not to burden you with my troubles. Nevertheless, I'm here now, and I'm involved whether you intended it or not." Edith began gathering the scattered papers into neat piles. "I have some savings from my years of managing Harold's household. Not much, but perhaps enough to help." "Absolutely not." Jonas's voice carried firm resolve. "I won't take charity from a woman who's already lost everything she owned. It wouldn't be charity if it was an investment in our mutual future." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither had intended to voice so soon. Edith felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how her suggestion might be interpreted, but she didn't retreat from it. "I mean," she continued steadily, "that if we're to make this arrangement work long-term, we both need the ranch to survive. I have skills that could help: bookkeeping, correspondence, perhaps even some business ideas. But those skills are worthless if there's no business left to apply them to." Jonas studied her face with the careful attention of a man trying to read weather signs in an uncertain sky. "Miss Mayhew, I can't ask you to risk your savings on a venture that might fail anyway." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Edith met his gaze with quiet determination. "Jonas, I'm 59 years old. I've spent most of my life letting other people make decisions for me, always choosing the safe path, always worrying about what was proper and appropriate. Where did that caution get me? Stranded at a train station with no family, no home, and no prospects beyond your unexpected kindness." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "Perhaps it's time I took a chance on something worthwhile. Perhaps it's time I bet on a man who would offer shelter to a stranger rather than a banker who sees only numbers on a page." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with pride, practical concerns, and something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. Finally, he spoke in a voice rough with emotion. "If we do this, if we pool our resources and try to save the ranch together, we'd be partners in truth, not just in convenience. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Edith felt her heart skip as she considered the question. Partnership implied trust, mutual dependence, and a future that neither of them could navigate alone. It meant casting her lot completely with this weathered cowboy who had already shown her more genuine kindness than she'd received in years. "I believe I am," she said quietly. "The question is whether you're prepared to trust a woman you've known for 3 days with your life's work." Jonas extended his hand across the desk, and Edith took it without hesitation. His palm was warm and calloused, steady in a way that made her feel anchored for the first time since Harold's death. "Partners," he said simply. "Partners," she agreed, and felt the word reshape the very air around them, transforming two lonely strangers into something neither had dared to hope for: a team with a shared stake in tomorrow. 2 weeks had passed since Edith and Jonas shook hands over his cluttered desk, sealing their partnership with a gravity that still made her pulse quicken when she remembered it. The simple curtains she'd sewn for the bunkhouse windows now caught the morning light, transforming the stark room into something that felt surprisingly like home. Made from fabric remnants she'd found in her trunk-soft blue cotton with tiny white flowers, they represented her first attempt to put her mark on this place. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Charlie Brennan, the oldest of Jonas's ranch hands, had stood in the doorway that first morning after she'd hung them, his weathered face creasing into what might have been approval. "Brightens the place considerable," he'd said in his slow, careful way. "Ain't had curtains in this house since Jonas's ma passed, and that's been near 15 years now." Now, as Edith prepared breakfast for the 4 men who had become her unlikely family, she found herself humming something she hadn't done since before Harold's illness. The simple pleasure of creating order and comfort from chaos filled a need she hadn't realized she possessed. This wasn't the grudging domestic duty that had defined her years with Harold, but something chosen freely, something that mattered. Jonas entered the kitchen as she was turning bacon, his hair still damp from washing at the pump outside. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd grown accustomed to these small intimacies of shared living, the sound of his boots on the porch at dawn, the way he carefully hung his hat on the peg by the door, the quiet courtesy with which he waited for her to serve herself before beginning his own meal. "Morning, Edith," he said, and the sound of her Christian name still sent a small thrill through her. They'd abandoned formal address by mutual agreement after the 3rd day, when the pretense of employer and employee had become too artificial to maintain. "Good morning, Jonas. Coffee's fresh, and the biscuits should be ready in a few minutes." She'd taken over cooking duties without discussion, partly because her skills far exceeded Jonas's basic competency, but mostly because she found deep satisfaction in feeding people well. The ranch hands had responded to her efforts with the kind of grateful enthusiasm typically reserved for unexpected windfalls. "Smells like heaven in here," Tom Reeves announced as he and Charlie entered, followed by young Billy Morrison, who at 19 was still growing into his long limbs and abundant appetite. "Miss Edith, I swear you're spoiling us beyond redemption." "Good food never spoiled anyone worth knowing," Edith replied, serving generous portions of eggs and bacon. "Besides, you boys work hard enough to earn decent meals." The easy acceptance these men had shown her still amazed her. Ranch hands, in her limited experience, were rough creatures with little use for feminine sensibilities. But Jonas's men treated her with a respect that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. They wiped their boots before entering, moderated their language in her presence, and showed sincere appreciation for the domestic comforts she provided. After breakfast, as the men headed out to their daily tasks, Jonas lingered at the table with his coffee. This had become their routine here, few minutes of quiet conversation before the day's demands claimed them both. "The account books are looking better," Edith reported, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup. I managed to negotiate extended payment terms with the feed supplier, and the new organization system should help us track expenses more accurately. Jonas nodded, though she could see the worry that never quite left his eyes these days. The bank payment loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and despite their combined efforts, they were still far from raising the necessary funds. I've been thinking, Edith continued carefully, about additional sources of income. I noticed several of the neighboring ranchers' wives at church last Sunday, and their dresses, well, they were functional, but hardly flattering. You thinking of taking in sewing work? More than that, I'm thinking of establishing a proper dressmaking business. There's clearly demand for skilled seamstress services in this area, and women will pay well for clothes that make them feel attractive. Jonas considered this, his expression thoughtful. It's a good idea, but would you have time for such work on top of everything else you're doing here? The question touched on something they'd both been avoiding: the nature of their arrangement and where it might lead. Edith had thrown herself into domestic duties with an enthusiasm that suggested permanence, while Jonas had responded with increasing protectiveness and consideration. They were acting like a married couple in all but name, yet neither had voiced what that might mean for their future. I'd make time, Edith said simply. We need every source of income we can manage. Edith, Jonas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. The gesture was becoming less surprising but no less affecting. I don't want you wearing yourself out trying to save my ranch. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. It's not just your ranch anymore, remember? We're partners. The word carried weight that went beyond their financial arrangement. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd fallen into a rhythm of shared decision-making that felt natural despite their brief acquaintance. Jonas consulted her on ranch matters, while she sought his approval for household changes. They were building something together, though neither was quite ready to name what that something might become. Speaking of partnerships, Jonas said, his thumb tracing across her knuckles in a gesture that made her breath catch, I was wondering if you might help me with something this evening. Of course. What do you need? Jonas's face reddened slightly. I was hoping you might continue teaching me to read better. Those poetry samplers of yours have words I've never encountered, and I'd like to understand them properly. The request touched Edith deeply. Jonas could manage basic reading enough to handle simple correspondence, and Billsbot literature remained largely beyond his reach. The poetry samplers she'd embroidered over the years contained verses that spoke to her romantic heart, dreams she'd never expected to share with anyone. I'd be honored to help, she said softly. Though I should warn you, some of the verses are rather well. They express sentiments that might seem foolish coming from a woman my age. Edith Mayhew, Jonas said firmly, his hand tightening over hers. There's nothing foolish about you. Not your age, not your dreams, and certainly not your sentiments. The sincerity in his voice made her eyes sting with unshed tears. When had anyone last spoken to her with such respect and admiration? Harold had always treated her romantic inclinations as embarrassing weaknesses to be discouraged. Other men had seen only her practical skills or her brother's modest property. But Jonas looked at her as if she was someone worth knowing completely. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting her voice for more. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the table, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Jonas released her hand and moved to the window, his posture immediately alert. Rider coming in fast, he announced, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door. Don't recognize the horse. Edith joined him at the window, watching as a young man she didn't recognize dismounted near the barn. He was well dressed for frontier standards, with clothes that suggested town rather than ranch life. Jonas Pike? The stranger called out. That's me, Jonas replied, stepping onto the porch with the rifle held casually but ready. What can I do for you? Message from the bank in Dry Willow, the man said, producing an envelope from his jacket. Mr. Henderson said it was urgent. Edith's stomach clenched as Jonas accepted the envelope. Bank messages were rarely good news, especially when delivered by special messenger rather than regular mail. She watched Jonas's face as he struggled through the formal language, his expression growing increasingly grim. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Jonas handed her the letter without speaking. As Edith read, her heart sank with each carefully crafted phrase. The bank was accelerating their timeline. Instead of 30 days, they now had 2 weeks to settle the debt or face immediate foreclosure proceedings. Apparently, another borrower had defaulted, leaving the bank in need of liquid assets to satisfy nervous investors. "Can they do this?" Edith asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The loan documents probably give them that right," Jonas replied heavily. "Banks don't usually lend money without protecting themselves against exactly this kind of situation." The messenger cleared his throat apologetically. "I was told to wait for a response, if you have one." Jonas and Edith exchanged glances. 2 weeks. Even with their combined resources and most aggressive economy measures, they couldn't possibly raise $800 in 2 weeks. The ranch that had been Jonas's life's work, the home that had begun to feel like her own, all of it, would be lost. "Tell Mr. Henderson we received his message," Jonas said finally. "We'll be in touch." After the messenger left, Jonas and Edith stood on the porch in heavy silence. The morning that had begun with such promising new curtains, shared plans, growing intimacy now felt overshadowed by impending disaster. "There has to be something we can do," Edith said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Jonas replied, but his tone suggested he was reaching for hope that felt increasingly distant. "Maybe we can figure something out." As they walked back into the house, Edith caught sight of her blue curtains dancing in the morning breeze. Such a small thing, but they'd made this place feel like home. The thought of losing not just the ranch, but this newfound sense of belonging made her chest tighten with desperation. 2 weeks. Somehow, they had to find a miracle in 2 weeks. Evening settled over Willow Bend Ranch like a gentle benediction, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Edith of the silk fabrics she'd once dreamed of using for her own wedding dress. Such dreams felt both foolish and precious now, sitting beside Jonas in the lamplight as he struggled through the verses embroidered on her poetry sampler. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds," Jonas read slowly, his finger following each word with careful precision. The sampler, worked in delicate cross-stitch during the lonely evenings of her life with Harold, contained Shakespeare's sonnet, 116 verses, that had sustained her through years when romance seemed an impossible luxury. "Or bends with the remover to remove," Edith prompted gently when Jonas paused over the unfamiliar words. "Or bends with the remover to remove," he repeated, then looked up at her with genuine curiosity. "What does that mean exactly? The language is mighty fancy." Edith felt warmth spread through her chest at his earnest desire to understand. "It means that true love doesn't change when circumstances change, or disappear when the person you love goes away. It's constant, like a lighthouse that ships can depend on even in storms." Jonas nodded thoughtfully, his calloused finger tracing the delicate stitches. "You made this?" "Years ago. I was 25 and still believed that someday." She stopped, embarrassed by the admission. "Someday what?" Jonas's voice carried no judgment, only gentle interest. "Someday someone might love me the way Shakespeare wrote about love, constant and true, seeing past surface imperfections to something worth cherishing." Edith laughed softly at her own foolishness. "I suppose every woman has such dreams at 25. "And at 59, Jonas asked quietly. The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Edith met his gaze, seeing in his brown eyes a hunger that matched her own, not just for physical intimacy, but for the deeper connection that came from being truly known and accepted. "At 59, she said carefully, "such dreams seem both more precious and more impossible." "Why impossible?" "Because," Edith gestured helplessly at herself. "Look at me, Jonas. I'm not the young woman who stitched those romantic verses. I'm past my prime, past the age when such feelings are considered appropriate or—" "Edith." Jonas set down the sampler and took her hands in his own. "I am looking at you. I see a woman who makes my coffee taste better just by sharing the cup." I see hands that can create beauty from scraps of fabric and turn a house into a home. I see eyes that light up when you laugh, and a heart generous enough to risk everything for a man you barely know." His words made her breath catch in her throat. "Jonas, I see a woman who makes me want to learn poetry so I can understand the thoughts in her head. A woman who makes me think that maybe, just maybe, those dreams you stitched into your sampler weren't foolish at all." Before Edith could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Jonas immediately shifted into protective mode, rising to peer out the window while keeping himself between Edith and potential danger. "3 riders," he reported, relaxing slightly as he recognized the silhouettes. "It's Tom and Charlie, but I don't know the third one." They stepped onto the porch as the riders approached. Tom and Charlie looked grim, flanking a young cowboy who appeared to be fighting a fever despite the cool evening air. "Found Billy down by Willow Creek," Charlie called out. "Horse threw him, and he's been laying in the cold water for hours. Fever's got him pretty bad." Jonas was down the porch steps before Charlie finished speaking, helping to ease the semi-conscious young man from his saddle. Billy Morrison, barely 19 and far from his family in Missouri, had become something of a favorite with all of them. He worked hard, never complained, and brought a youthful optimism to the ranch that lightened everyone's spirits. "Get him inside," Edith commanded, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd developed during years of managing household crises. "I'll prepare a bed and get water boiling." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity that felt both foreign and familiar to Edith. She'd nursed Harold through his final illness, but that had been a slow decline toward an inevitable end. This was different, a young man fighting for his life, his fever spiking dangerously as his body struggled against what appeared to be pneumonia. Jonas carried Billy to the spare room while Edith gathered supplies, clean linens, medicine from her small store of remedies, hot water bottles to combat the chills that racked the young cowboy's frame. She worked with the efficiency born of experience, her movements sure and purposeful. "What can we do?" Jonas asked, hovering anxiously as Edith felt Billy's forehead with practiced concern. "Keep him warm but not overheated, get fluids into him when he's conscious enough to swallow, and pray." Edith replied, "I have some willow bark tea that might help with the fever, and laudanum if the pain becomes too severe." For 3 days, they took turns sitting with Billy as he fought the infection. Edith found herself falling naturally into the role of chief nurse, while Jonas and the other hands maintained the ranch operations with quiet efficiency. The crisis brought out the best in all of them: Charlie's steady competence, Tom's gentle humor when Billy was lucid enough to appreciate it, Jonas's protective care that extended to every member of his small family. On the 3rd night, as Billy's fever finally broke and he slept peacefully for the first time since his accident, Jonas found Edith slumped in the chair beside the sickbed, exhausted from her vigil. "Come on," he said softly, helping her to her feet. "He's past the worst of it now. You need rest." Edith allowed him to guide her to the kitchen, where he pressed a cup of coffee into her hands and settled beside her at the table. The house felt different in the small hours of the morning, more intimate, as if the darkness had stripped away all pretense and left only truth. "You were magnificent," Jonas said quietly. "The way you took charge, knew exactly what to do. Billy owes his life to your nursing." "I've had practice," Edith replied, thinking of Harold's long decline. "Though I must admit, it feels different when you're fighting to save someone rather than simply making them comfortable." "Is that what you did for your brother? Made him comfortable?" Edith nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of those difficult months. "The doctor said there was no hope, that the cancer would take him regardless of treatment. So I tried to make his remaining time as peaceful as possible. It wasn't," she paused, searching for words, "it wasn't a happy ending, but it was the best ending we could manage." Jonas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing between them. "You gave him dignity and love when he needed it most. That's no small gift. Sometimes I wonder if I should have pushed harder for treatments, sought other opinions." "Edith," Jonas's voice carried gentle firmness, "you did what love required. Don't torture yourself with might, have-beens." The simple absolution in his words broke something loose in her chest, and suddenly tears were streaming down her face, tears she'd held back during Harold's illness, during the lonely journey to Dry Willow Station, during all the uncertainty of her new life. Jonas moved around the table and gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept for losses both old and new. "I'm sorry," she gasped against his shoulder. "I don't know why. Because you've been strong for everyone else, and now someone's offering to be strong for you." Jonas murmured, his hand stroking her hair with infinite tenderness. "That's what partners do for each other." As her tears subsided, Edith became acutely aware of their position, her pressed against Jonas's chest, his arms wrapped around her with protective warmth, his breath stirring her hair. The intimacy should have felt shocking, inappropriate for a woman of her age and circumstance. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Jonas," she whispered, not pulling away, but needing to acknowledge what was happening between them. "I know," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I know this complicates everything. I know it's not what either of us planned when we shook hands over those account books." "Is it wrong?" she asked, finally lifting her head to meet his gaze. "Two people our age feeling this way?" "If it's wrong," Jonas said, his thumb brushing away the last of her tears, "then I don't want to be right. Edith, I've been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether I came home safe at night. You've given me that, and so much more." "What are we doing?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "I think," Jonas said slowly, "we're discovering that it's never too late for dreams to come true, even dreams stitched into poetry samplers by women who thought their chance at love had passed them by." As dawn light began to filter through the windows, they sat together in comfortable silence, Edith still wrapped in Jonas's arms, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The ranch's financial crisis still loomed, Billy still needed careful tending, and a dozen practical concerns demanded their attention. But for this moment, in the quiet sanctuary of their kitchen, they allowed themselves to believe that love might indeed be the constant star that Shakespeare had promised unwavering, even when everything else seemed lost. The envelope bearing the bank's official seal lay on Jonas's desk like a coiled rattlesnake, its presence poisoning the morning air, despite the cheerful sounds of breakfast preparation in the kitchen. Billy Morrison, recovered from his fever but still pale, sat carefully at the table while Edith fussed over him with the protective attention of a mother hen. The scene should have been comforting family gathered around food and fellowship, but the foreclosure notice made everything feel precarious, temporary. Jonas had read the document 3 times, each reading confirming what he'd understood from the first. 10 days remained before the bank would seize everything he'd built over 30 years of back-breaking labor. 10 days to find $800 that might as well have been $8,000 for all the likelihood of raising such a sum. "You're not eating," Edith observed, settling beside him with her own plate. Since the night she'd broken down in his arms while nursing Billy, their relationship had shifted into something deeper but undefined. They touched more frequently, hands brushing as they passed dishes, his palm resting briefly on her shoulder as he moved behind her chair. Yet they continued to sleep in separate rooms, maintaining a careful propriety that satisfied neither of them but seemed necessary given their uncertain circumstances. "Lost my appetite," Jonas admitted, pushing eggs around his plate without enthusiasm. Charlie Brennan, who'd been working for Jonas longer than anyone, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Boss, me and the boys have been talking. If you need to sell our horses to raise cash, we'll understand." The offer touched Jonas deeply while simultaneously breaking his heart. These men had ridden for him through droughts, harsh winters, and lean years when their wages came late or in trade rather than currency. Their horses represented their independence, their ability to move on if circumstances demanded it. For them to offer such a sacrifice spoke to a loyalty that humbled him. "I appreciate that, Charlie, more than you know. But selling your horses wouldn't raise enough to matter, and it would leave you boys stranded if things go bad." "Then what are we going to do?" Tom Reeves asked bluntly. "Just sit here and wait for the bank to throw us off the land?" Before Jonas could respond, the sound of approaching wagon wheels interrupted their grim discussion. Through the window, they could see a well-appointed buggy making its way up the dusty lane, the kind of vehicle that suggested money and authority. "Now what?" Jonas muttered, rising to meet whatever new crisis approached. The man who climbed down from the buggy was everything Jonas was not soft, where Jonas was weathered, impeccably dressed, where Jonas's clothes showed honest wear, carrying himself with the confidence that came from never having worried about money. He was perhaps 45, with carefully groomed whiskers and hands that had never seen calluses. "Mr. Pike, I'm Benjamin Cartwright, president of Territorial Holdings Company. I wonder if we might have a word about your property situation." Jonas felt his stomach tighten. Territorial Holdings was known throughout the region as a company that bought distressed properties at bargain prices, then either sold them to wealthy investors or stripped them of anything valuable before abandoning them to weeds and neglect. "Mr. Cartwright," Jonas replied carefully, "I suppose you've heard about my difficulties with the bank." "Word travels fast in small communities," Cartwright agreed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you're facing foreclosure within the week. That's a terrible situation for a man who's worked so hard to build something worthwhile." Edith appeared at Jonas's shoulder, her presence both comforting and strengthening. Cartwright's gaze flicked over her with the dismissive assessment of a man accustomed to judging everything by its potential profit. "Mrs. Pike, I presume?" "Miss Mayhew," Edith corrected coolly. "I manage Mr. Pike's household accounts." "Ah." Cartwright's tone suggested he understood exactly what such an arrangement implied, and disapproved. "Well then, perhaps you'll both be interested in my proposal. Territorial Holdings is prepared to purchase this property for fair market value, settling your debt with the bank and leaving you with a tidy sum to start fresh elsewhere." "What's fair market value to your way of thinking?" Jonas asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Given the current economic climate and the property's outstanding liens, I'm authorized to offer $1,200 for the 800 acres, including all buildings and improvements." The figure hit Jonas like a physical blow. $1,200 for land and buildings that had cost him nearly 3 times that amount to develop. After settling the bank debt, he'd be left with $400, barely enough to buy passage to California and a month's lodging while seeking work. "That's robbery," Edith said flatly, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. Cartwright's smile became condescending. "Miss Mayhew, I understand this is an emotional situation, but business requires realistic assessment of assets and liabilities. Mr. Pike's property, while well-maintained, carries significant debt and limited development potential. Our offer reflects current market conditions. Your offer reflects opportunistic vulturism," Edith replied, her color rising. "This ranch has been improved with 30 years of honest labor. The buildings alone are worth more than you're offering for the entire property." "Buildings have value only if someone wants to buy them," Cartwright countered smoothly. "And frankly, there aren't many buyers interested in remote ranch properties in today's market." Jonas found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. "What happens to my hands if I sell to you?" "That's hardly my concern, though I'm sure capable men can find employment elsewhere." The casual dismissal of Charlie, Tom, and Billy's welfare crystallized something in Jonas's mind. These weren't just employees, they were family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual loyalty. Cartwright's offer would destroy not just Jonas's dreams, but the livelihood of 3 men who'd stood by him through every crisis. "I need time to consider your proposal," Jonas said finally. "Of course. However, I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. The bank's foreclosure timeline creates certain urgencies, and if another interested party emerges, well," Cartwright shrugged elegantly, "business is business." After Cartwright departed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and vague threats, Jonas and Edith stood on the porch in heavy silence. The morning that had begun with simple domestic contentment now felt poisoned by the reality of their situation. $1,200, Jonas said finally. For everything I've built. It's not enough, Edith replied firmly. Not nearly enough. It's more than I'll have if the bank forecloses. At least this way, we'd walk away with something. We? Edith turned to face him, her brown eyes intense with emotion he couldn't quite read. Jonas, what exactly are you suggesting? The question forced him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding for weeks. What was he suggesting? That she would follow him to some uncertain future in California or Oregon? That their partnership extended beyond the ranch's survival? That the growing intimacy between them meant something more than convenient companionship? I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know what I'm suggesting, Edith. All I know is that the thought of losing this place is killing me, but the thought of losing you along with it, that's unbearable. Edith's expression softened, and she reached for his hand with the natural gesture that had become second nature between them. Then we need to find another way. There has to be something we haven't considered. Like what? We've been over the books a dozen times. We've explored every possibility for raising money quickly. Short of discovering gold in the creek bed, I don't see any alternatives. Then perhaps it's time to consider alternatives that don't involve raising money. Edith said thoughtfully, what if we approach the bank directly? Explain your situation. Propose a different arrangement. Jonas shook his head. Henderson's made it clear that his patience is exhausted. The bank needs cash, not promises. What about finding another buyer? Someone who might offer a fair price rather than Cartwright's insulting lowball. Who? Anyone with that kind of money is either already established elsewhere or looking for easier investments than struggling cattle ranches. They were still discussing possibilities when Charlie approached, his hat in his hands and his expression troubled. Boss, I hate to interrupt, but there's something you need to know about that Cartwright fellow. What's that, Charlie? I recognized him from a few years back, when he bought out the Morrison spread up north. Young Billy's family place, before they moved to Missouri. Billy Morrison looked up sharply from where he'd been quietly listening. He bought our ranch? After your pa died and your ma couldn't keep up the payments, Charlie confirmed. Cartwright came in with promises about fair treatment and preserving your family's legacy. 2 months later, he'd stripped the buildings of anything valuable and left the land to grow weeds. Your ma got her money, but everything your pa built just disappeared. The revelation hit Billy like a physical blow. His young face paled as he processed the implications, not just for his own family's legacy, but for what might happen to the only home he'd known since leaving Missouri. He can't do that here, Billy said, his voice cracking with emotion. This place it's our home. Jonas felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. Billy's faith in the ranch's permanence, Charlie and Tom's loyalty, Edith's trust in their partnership, all of it would be destroyed if he accepted Cartwright's offer. Yet what choice did he have? There's one more thing, Charlie continued reluctantly. Word around town is that Cartwright's already made inquiries about selling this land to Eastern investors for some kind of development project. Mining maybe, or timber speculation. Either way, he ain't planning to preserve what's here. The knowledge that Cartwright intended to destroy rather than preserve everything Jonas had built added insult to an already devastating injury. This wasn't just about money, it was about erasing 30 years of honest work, scattering a family of loyal men, and reducing dreams to mere commodity. 10 days, Jonas said quietly, more to himself than to the others. We've got 10 days to find a miracle. As if summoned by his words, another rider appeared on the horizon, this one moving with the urgent pace of someone carrying important news. Jonas squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out the figure approaching their gate. Looks like young Timothy from the post office, Tom observed, and he's riding like the devil's chasing him. Whatever news Timothy carried, Jonas suspected it would either save them or deliver the final blow to their hopes. Either way, their 10 days of grace might be about to become something much shorter, much more complicated. Timothy Kellerman dismounted with the graceless urgency of someone unaccustomed to hard riding, clutching a telegram that had clearly been folded and unfolded multiple times during his journey from town. The young postal clerk's face bore the expression of someone carrying momentous news, whether good or ill remained to be determined. "Mr. Pike," Timothy gasped, still catching his breath. "This came through on the wire this morning. Mr. Henderson at the bank said to get it to you immediate." Jonas accepted the telegram with hands that trembled slightly, despite his efforts at composure. Edith moved closer, her presence steadying him as he unfolded the yellow paper and struggled through the tersely worded message. "What does it say?" Edith asked gently, when Jonas's prolonged silence suggested difficulty with the formal language. "It's from a law firm back in Chicago," Jonas said slowly, his voice carrying bewilderment rather than joy or despair. "Something about my late father's estate and mineral rights." He handed her the telegram. "Maybe you can make more sense of it than I can." Edith read quickly, her eyes widening as she processed the legal terminology. "Jonas, this says that your adoptive father owned mineral rights to this property that were never properly transferred upon his death. A recent geological survey has identified significant silver deposits, and there's a mining company interested in negotiating extraction rights." The words hung in the air like morning mist, too insubstantial to trust, yet carrying the promise of transformation. Jonas had vague memories of his adoptive father mentioning something about mineral rights years ago, but the old man had died when Jonas was barely 20. And such matters had seemed far less important than learning to manage cattle and survive harsh winters. "Silver?" Billy Morrison asked, his young voice bright with hope. "You mean like actual silver mining?" "That's what it says," Edith confirmed, though her tone suggested cautious skepticism rather than celebration. "The telegram requests that Mr. Pike contact the law firm immediately to discuss terms." Charlie Brennan, who possessed the pragmatic wisdom of a man who'd seen too many promises prove empty, scratched his graying beard thoughtfully. "Begging your pardon, boss, but this seems mighty convenient timing. You sure this ain't some kind of confidence scheme?" The observation sobered them all. Jonas had heard stories of elaborate frauds targeting desperate property owners, fake mining companies, forged documents, and smooth-talking conmen who disappeared once they'd extracted whatever money or property rights they could steal. "There's only one way to find out," Jonas said finally. "I'll need to ride to Dry Willow and send a reply telegram." "I'll come with you," Edith said immediately. "Edith, that's not necessary." "It absolutely is necessary." Her voice carried the firm tone he'd learned to recognize when her mind was made up. "If this is legitimate, the negotiations will require careful attention to details that, forgive me, you're not equipped to handle alone. If it's fraudulent, you'll need someone there to ask the right questions." Jonas felt a flush of embarrassment at the gentle reminder of his educational limitations, but he couldn't argue with her logic. Edith's years of managing Harold's affairs had given her experience with legal documents and business correspondence that far exceeded his own. "Besides," she continued with a slight smile, "partners don't let partners face potential windfall or disaster alone." The word partners had taken on layers of meaning that extended far beyond their original financial arrangement. Jonas found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether their partnership might evolve into something more permanent and profound. As they prepared for the journey to town, Jonas became aware of watching eyes from the direction of the main road. A lone horseman sat motionless on the ridge, overlooking their property, too distant to identify but positioned where he could observe all activity at the ranch. The figure's stillness and strategic location suggested surveillance rather than casual travel. "Charlie," Jonas called to his foreman, "see that rider on the north ridge?" Charlie followed Jonas's gaze and nodded grimly. "Been there about an hour. Ain't moving, ain't showing any intention of approaching. Makes a man wonder what he's watching for." The presence of a potential spy added an ominous note to their journey. If word of the mineral rights had somehow reached Cartwright or other interested parties, their brief window of opportunity might be closing faster than anticipated. The ride to Dry Willow passed mostly in silence, both Jonas and Edith lost in contemplation of the morning's developments. The landscape around them, rolling prairie dotted with scrub brush and occasional stands of cottonwood, suddenly looked different when viewed as potentially valuable mining territory rather than simple grazing land. "Jonas," Edith said as they neared town, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Always do. If this mineral rights situation proves legitimate, if there's genuine wealth to be extracted from your land, how will that change things between us?" The question struck him as profoundly important, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I came to you as a woman with nothing, grateful for honest work and a place to belong. If you suddenly become wealthy, people will assume I was somehow scheming for this outcome all along. They'll say, I saw your potential fortune and manipulated you into dependence on me." Jonas pulled his horse to a halt and turned to face her fully. "Edith Mayhew, do you honestly think I'd believe such nonsense? It doesn't matter what you believe if it's what everyone else assumes. Your position in the community would change dramatically. You'd have opportunities for marriage that—" She stopped, clearly struggling with thoughts she wasn't ready to voice completely. "That what? That would be more appropriate than partnership with a spinster dressmaker." "Exactly." Jonas dismounted and helped Edith down from her horse, taking her hands in his own as they stood beside the dusty road. "Let me tell you something about appropriate, Edith. I've spent 54 years trying to live up to other people's ideas of what was appropriate, proper, and expected. Where did it get me? Alone, struggling, and facing the loss of everything I'd worked for." He paused, gathering courage for words that felt more important than any he'd ever spoken. "You came into my life when I had nothing to offer but hard work and uncertain prospects. You chose to stay, to help, to build something with me, when any sensible woman would have taken the first train back east. If silver in the ground changes my circumstances, it doesn't change the fact that you're the best thing that's happened to me in 30 years. Edith's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "Jonas." "I'm not finished." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "If there's wealth to be found on my land, then as my partner, half of it belongs to you. Not because of some legal obligation, but because everything good that's happened since you arrived has been the result of our combined efforts. People will say whatever suits their need for gossip and drama. Let them talk. You and I will know the truth, and that's what matters." They were interrupted by the approach of another rider, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, wife of Dry Willow's largest merchant and unofficial coordinator of the town's social hierarchy. Her expression as she observed Jonas and Edith, standing close together beside the road, suggested disapproval mixed with avid curiosity. "Mr. Pike, Miss Mayhew," she said with cool politeness as she drew her horse alongside them. "How fortuitous to encounter you on the road. I've been meaning to call on you, Miss Mayhew, to discuss your situation." The pause before "situation" carried volumes of judgment and social positioning. Jonas felt his protective instincts surge, but Edith's slight pressure on his hand cautioned restraint. "How kind of you to take interest, Mrs. Patterson," Edith replied with perfectly controlled courtesy. "Though I confess I'm uncertain what aspect of my situation might concern you." "Well, naturally. As a woman of, shall we say, mature years, living in such close quarters with an unmarried man, there are questions of propriety that affect the entire community's reputation." The accusation, delivered with the poisonous sweetness of refined social warfare, made Jonas's jaw clench with suppressed anger. But before he could respond, Edith stepped slightly forward, her posture carrying the dignity of someone who'd faced down such attacks before. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern for community standards. However, as a woman who's managed her own affairs independently for decades, I'm quite capable of maintaining appropriate conduct without supervision. Mr. Pike has shown me nothing but respect and courtesy, qualities that speak well of his character and upbringing. Nevertheless, appearances matter, my dear. Perhaps you might consider seeking more suitable accommodations in town, where proper chaperoning could be maintained." "And perhaps," Jonas interjected, his voice carrying quiet steel, You might consider that a woman's reputation is her own to manage, and a man's character is demonstrated by his actions rather than subject to speculation by busybodies. Mrs. Patterson's face flushed at the direct rebuke. Mr. Pike, I hardly think— Ma'am, with respect, I don't much care what you think about my household arrangements. Miss Mayhew is a lady of impeccable character who's brought nothing but improvement to my life and property. Anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to discuss their concerns with me directly. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. A familiar figure rode toward them, Benjamin Cartwright, his expensive clothes and superior manner even more pronounced in contrast to their dusty, practical attire. "Mr. Pike, Miss Mayhew," Cartwright called out as he approached. "What excellent timing. I was hoping to speak with you before you made any hasty decisions about my offer." Jonas felt pieces clicking together in his mind like tumblers in a lock. The mysterious rider watching their ranch, Mrs. Patterson's pointed questions about Edith's situation, and now Cartwright's convenient appearance on the road to town, none of it felt coincidental. "Mr. Cartwright," he replied carefully, "I don't recall mentioning any plans to be in town today." "Word travels quickly in small communities," Cartwright said with his practiced smile. "I merely hoped to clarify certain aspects of our previous discussion, such as the time-sensitive nature of my offer and the potential complications that might arise if certain developments were to influence your decision-making process." The carefully neutral phrasing carried an unmistakable threat. Somehow, Cartwright had learned about the mineral rights telegram, and his presence here suggested either an attempt to prevent Jonas from investigating further or a desire to pressure him into accepting the lowball offer before discovering the property's true value. "I appreciate your concern for my decision-making process," Jonas replied with equal care. "But I believe I'm capable of evaluating my options without outside pressure." "Of course. However, I'd hate to see a man of your obvious integrity become involved in something that might prove disappointing." The word disappointing carried ominous undertones that made Edith step closer to Jonas's side. Whatever game Cartwright was playing, it involved more than simple property speculation. "Mr. Cartwright," Edith said with deceptive mildness, "are you suggesting that Mr. Pike might be the victim of some kind of fraud?" "I'm merely observing that sudden windfalls often prove too good to be true, especially when they arrive at such convenient moments. A prudent man might prefer the certainty of a legitimate offer to the uncertainty of speculative ventures." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Kellerman, who'd apparently followed them to town with additional news. His expression suggested urgency mixed with confusion. "Mr. Pike," Timothy called out, "there's been another telegram. This one's from the Territorial Governor's office." The Territorial Governor's telegram crackled between Jonas's fingers as he struggled to comprehend its contents, the formal language dancing before his eyes like symbols from a foreign country. Edith gently took the document from his trembling hands, her face growing pale as she absorbed the legal terminology that would reshape their understanding of everything. "Jonas," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure, "this isn't just about mineral rights. According to this document, your adoptive father never legally transferred ownership of this land to you. Technically, you've been a caretaker rather than an owner for the past 30 years. The words hit him like a physical blow. Everything he'd believed about his life, his legacy, his right to call Willow Bend Ranch home, all of it, built on a foundation that had never legally existed. "That's impossible," Jonas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Pa told me the land was mine when he died. I've been paying taxes on it, making improvements. The territorial government has been conducting a comprehensive land survey." Edith continued reading. "Apparently, your father's original claim was never properly filed, and the subsequent inheritance was never formalized through appropriate channels. However," she paused, her eyes widening as she read further, "however, the recent geological survey has identified this property as containing one of the largest silver deposits in the territory." Benjamin Cartwright, who had been listening to this exchange with barely concealed interest, stepped forward with his practiced smile, now tinged with something more predatory. "Pike, this certainly complicates your situation. If your claim to the property is legally questionable, any mineral rights would naturally revert to territorial control. Unless," came a new voice from behind them, "the current occupant can demonstrate continuous habitation and improvement sufficient to qualify for homestead privileges under the Territorial Settlement Act of 1893. They turned to see a tall, distinguished man, approaching on horseback, elderly, but carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His clothes were well made but practical, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed very little. Judge Harrison Blackwood. The newcomer introduced himself, dismounting with the careful grace of advanced years. "I've been sent by the territorial governor to investigate this particular property situation." Cartwright's confident expression flickered momentarily. "Judge Blackwood, I wasn't aware the territorial government was taking direct interest in individual land disputes." "Mr. Cartwright, when potential mineral wealth of this magnitude is involved, the territorial government takes interest in ensuring proper legal procedures are followed." Judge Blackwood's tone suggested familiarity with Cartwright that carried no warmth, particularly when certain companies have shown patterns of acquiring disputed properties through, shall we say, questionable methods. The old judge removed a leather portfolio from his saddlebags and extracted a sheaf of documents. "Mr. Pike, I've been reviewing the historical records of your property claim. Your adoptive father, Samuel Pike, filed an initial homestead claim in 1862, but the paperwork was never completed due to his service in the territorial militia during the Indian conflicts of 1863–64. Jonas felt his world tilting on its axis. "So I don't own the land?" "Not exactly. However, you've maintained continuous residence and made substantial improvements for over 30 years. Under territorial law, that qualifies you for what we call adverse possession. Essentially, the land becomes yours through long-term beneficial use, regardless of the original filing irregularities." Relief flooded through Jonas like cool water in a drought, but Judge Blackwood held up a cautioning hand. "However, there are complications. The mineral rights were never included in your father's original claim because they weren't considered valuable at the time. Under current territorial law, those rights belong to whoever holds the legal title to the surface land, which, as of this moment, is you." "This is preposterous," Cartwright interjected, his composed demeanor finally cracking. "Surely the territorial government wouldn't allow such valuable mineral resources to remain in private hands based on a technicality." "Mr. Cartwright, the law is rarely about what's convenient for speculators. It's about what's just." Judge Blackwood turned back to Jonas. "Mr. Pike, the territorial governor, has authorized me to offer you formal title to your property, including all mineral rights, provided you can demonstrate your ability to develop the resources responsibly." The offer was everything Jonas could have dreamed of, yet something in the judge's manner suggested complications still lay ahead. "What does develop responsibly mean exactly?" Edith asked, her teacher's instincts detecting conditions hidden in official language. "It means Mr. Pike would need to form a proper mining company, employ territorial residents, and share a percentage of extracted wealth with the territorial treasury. It also means he'd need sufficient capital to begin mining operations within 2 years, or risk losing the mineral rights through abandonment." The requirements felt overwhelming. Jonas understood cattle and horses, simple ranch management and honest labor. The idea of running a mining company, managing complex financial arrangements, and dealing with territorial bureaucracy seemed as foreign as piloting a steamship. "How much capital would be required?" Edith pressed, her mind clearly working through practical implications. "Initial estimates suggest at least $10,000 for equipment, labor, and infrastructure development." The figure was staggering more money than Jonas had seen in his entire lifetime. Even if he sold the ranch for 10 times Cartwright's insulting offer, he couldn't raise such a sum. "Of course," Judge Blackwood continued, "the law does allow for partnerships with established mining interests, provided the original landowner maintains controlling interest in any extraction operations. Cartwright stepped forward again, his confidence returning. Judge Blackwood, Territorial Holdings would be happy to provide the necessary capital and expertise for such a venture. We could offer Mr. Pike a very generous partnership arrangement. I'm sure you could, the judge replied dryly. However, Mr. Pike has 60 days to evaluate his options and respond to the territorial government's offer. During that time, no other parties may file competing claims or pressure him regarding mineral rights disposition. The protection was welcome, but 60 days felt simultaneously like an eternity and no time at all. Jonas caught Edith's eye, seeing his own mixture of hope and terror reflected in her expression. "There's one more thing," Judge Blackwood said, pulling a final document from his portfolio. The Territorial Survey also identified this property as containing significant water rights underground springs that could supply mining operations throughout the region. Those rights, like the mineral rights, would belong to the surface landowner. Water rights in Dakota Territory were often more valuable than the land itself. During drought years, access to reliable water sources could mean the difference between prosperity and devastation for hundreds of square miles. "Judge," Jonas said slowly, trying to process the magnitude of what he was hearing, "are you saying I might own the water that supplies this entire valley?" "I'm saying the territorial government wants to ensure that valuable natural resources are developed by people who understand their responsibility to the community, rather than by speculators interested only in quick profits." The pointed look Judge Blackwood directed at Cartwright left no doubt about which category he believed the land company representative fell into. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening to this extraordinary conversation with growing amazement, finally found her voice. "Mr. Pike, do you realize what this means? You could be one of the wealthiest men in the territory." The observation was accurate but felt surreal. Yesterday, Jonas had been facing the loss of everything he'd worked for. Today, he was being told he might own mineral and water rights worth more than he could imagine. The reversal felt too dramatic to be real. "Edith," he said quietly, needing to anchor himself to something familiar, "what do you think?" Before she could respond, Cartwright stepped closer, his mask of civilized negotiation finally slipping to reveal something harder and more desperate. "Mr. Pike, I strongly advise you to consider the risks involved in such an undertaking. Mining is a dangerous business, full of unexpected expenses and potential catastrophes. Many men have lost everything pursuing silver dreams that prove to be nightmares. And many men have lost everything, trusting land companies that promised fair treatment." Edith replied sharply. "Mr. Pike has managed this property successfully for 30 years. I see no reason to doubt his ability to continue doing so. Miss Mayhew, with respect, cattle ranching and silver mining are entirely different enterprises. Mr. Pike would be wise to partner with experienced operators rather than risk everything on unproven ventures." "Mr. Cartwright," Judge Blackwood interjected, "I believe I made it clear that Mr. Pike has 60 days to consider his options without outside pressure. Your continued presence here suggests an inappropriate attempt to influence his decision-making process." Cartwright's face flushed with anger, but he managed to maintain a veneer of professional courtesy. "Of course, Judge. I merely wanted to ensure Mr. Pike understood all available alternatives." He turned to Jonas. "My offer remains open, should you decide that certainty is preferable to speculation." After Cartwright departed, followed by Mrs. Patterson, who was clearly eager to spread news of the morning's revelations throughout Dry Willow, Jonas found himself alone with Edith and Judge Blackwood beside the dusty road that had somehow become the site of his life's transformation. "Judge," Jonas said finally, "I appreciate what the territorial government is offering, but I have to be honest, I don't know the first thing about running a mining operation. The idea of managing $10,000 in capital, hiring workers, dealing with equipment and regulation seems impossible. Mr. Pike, successful mining operations require 3 essential elements: honest leadership, reliable water access, and sufficient capital. You've demonstrated the first through 30 years of ethical land management. Your property provides the second. The third can be arranged through proper partnerships, partnerships where you maintain control rather than surrendering it to outside interests. What kind of partnerships? Edith asked. There are mining engineers and equipment suppliers who work on commission rather than upfront fees, territorial banks that provide development loans secured by mineral rights, established mining companies that would pay premium prices for extraction rights while allowing you to maintain ownership. The possibilities were intriguing but overwhelming. Jonas felt as though he was standing at the edge of a vast canyon, being offered the chance to fly across it, but uncertain whether he possessed wings. "Judge, can I ask you something?" Jonas said. "Why is the territorial government so interested in keeping these rights in my hands rather than selling them to the highest bidder?" Judge Blackwood smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd shown all morning. "Mr. Pike, the territory is full of speculators who extract wealth and disappear, leaving behind empty holes and abandoned communities. We've learned that the best stewards of valuable resources are the people who live with the long-term consequences of how those resources are developed." As Judge Blackwood prepared to depart, leaving Jonas and Edith with legal documents that would require careful study and momentous decisions, the old man offered one final piece of advice. "Mr. Pike, Miss Mayhew Fortune has a way of testing character as severely as adversity does. The question isn't whether you can handle wealth, but whether wealth will change who you are at your core. Keep that in mind as you consider your options." Standing in the afternoon sun with a leather portfolio full of documents that could reshape their entire future, Jonas realized that the simple handshake he and Edith had shared over his account books had somehow grown into something far more significant than either of them had imagined. They were no longer just partners in saving a struggling ranch. They were potentially partners in building something that could affect the entire territory's development. The question was whether their relationship could survive such a dramatic transformation of circumstances, or whether the pressure of sudden wealth and opportunity would reveal fractures they hadn't known existed. The letter Jonas had never intended to send lay beneath Edith's travel dress like a physical weight against her heart. She'd discovered it while packing her belongings, finding the folded paper tucked inside the small Bible that had belonged to his mother, the same Bible where pressed flowers marked verses about love and endurance. The letter was written in Jonas's careful, labored handwriting, each word clearly costing him significant effort. As she read his confession of love, his plans to propose before the silver discovery had complicated everything, her resolve to leave Willow Bend began to crumble like banks of earth during spring flooding. "My dear Edith," the letter began, "I am not a man comfortable with fancy words, but there are things that need saying before I lose the courage to say them. You came into my life when I had nothing to offer but honest work and a roof that leaks when the wind blows from the north. You could have looked at my circumstances and found them wanting, but instead you rolled up your sleeves and helped me make something better of what we had." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Through the thin walls of the ranch house, she could hear Jonas in heated discussion with Charlie and Tom about contingency plans, what to do with the livestock if spring flooding made travel impossible, how to maintain the ranch operations if mining development required his attention elsewhere, whether the men would stay if circumstances changed dramatically. "I know folks will say a woman like you deserves better than a weathered cowboy who struggles to read poetry and burns biscuits more often than not," the letter continued. "But I also know that what's grown between us is real and rare and worth fighting for. I was planning to ask you to marry me, Edith. Not because it's convenient or practical, but because I love you in ways I didn't know were possible for a man my age." Outside, storm clouds gathered with the ominous weight of spring weather in Dakota Territory. The barometric pressure drop made her bones ache, while distant thunder promised the kind of violent storm that could wash away bridges, flood creeks, and strand travelers for days. "The silver changes everything, I know that. People will say, you stayed because you saw the potential for wealth, not because you cared for a broken-down rancher with more debts than assets. They'll say you were scheming all along, that your kindness was calculation rather than genuine feeling. The thought that you might believe such talk, or that it might drive you away from me, keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I've been living in a fool's paradise." Edith set the letter down with trembling hands, her heart breaking for the man who'd written these words, a man so convinced of his own unworthiness that he'd assumed the worst about her motives, rather than trust in what they'd built together. The silver discovery hadn't just complicated their financial situation. It had poisoned Jonas's ability to believe in her love. Heavy raindrops began striking the windows with increasing frequency, and Edith could hear Jonas's voice growing more urgent as he discussed emergency preparations with his men. Spring floods in this part of Dakota Territory were legendary for their destructive power, capable of washing away buildings, drowning livestock, and transforming peaceful creeks into raging torrents that redrew the landscape overnight. "Boss," Charlie's voice carried clearly through the walls. "If this storm's as bad as it looks to be, we might have more immediate problems than silver mining and bank payments. Willow Creek's already running high from the snowmelt, and this rain could put it over its banks by morning." "How high could it get?" Jonas asked. "High enough to reach the house if we're unlucky. High enough to wash away everything we've built if we're really unlucky." The practical crisis unfolding outside gave Edith a moment of clarity about her own situation. Here was Jonas, facing the potential loss of everything he'd worked for again, and her response was to pack her bags and flee rather than stand beside him when he needed her most. The realization filled her with shame. She set aside her half-packed trunk and moved to the window, watching as Jonas and his men worked with practiced efficiency to secure loose equipment, move vulnerable supplies to higher ground, and prepare for a siege that might last several days. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, not a potential silver baron or a desperate debtor, but someone who faced crisis with steady determination and protected what mattered to him. The letter's final paragraph burned in her memory. "If you're reading this, it means I've found the courage to speak my heart despite my fears about how the silver might change us. I'm not asking you to stay because I might be wealthy someday, Edith. I'm asking you to stay because I love you today, tomorrow, and for whatever years God might grant us together. Will you marry me not for silver or security, but for love that's already proven itself stronger than loneliness and disappointment?" A sharp knock interrupted her emotional turmoil. "Miss Edith." Billy Morrison's young voice carried urgency. "Mr. Pike needs you in the kitchen. Says we're about to have company whether we want it or not." Edith opened her door to find Billy's face pale with concern. "What kind of company?" "The kind that arrives uninvited and stays too long. Creeks rising faster than anyone expected, and there's a wagon full of folks stranded on the far side. They're gonna have to ride it out here whether we got room for them or not." Through the kitchen window, Edith could see a bedraggled group approaching through the driving Rayner family with children, their wagon abandoned somewhere behind them, carrying what belongings they could manage in the storm. Jonas was already on the porch, directing them toward shelter, despite the fact that the house was barely large enough for its current occupants. "How many people?" Edith asked, automatically shifting into crisis management mode. "Looks like 6, maybe 7. Family named Hendersono, relation to the banker traveling through when the storm caught them. Their wagons stuck in mud about 2 miles downstream, and the creeks cut off their retreat." Edith felt her priorities crystallize with startling clarity. Whatever doubts she harbored about Jonas's feelings, whatever concerns about the silver mining complications, whatever fears about social judgment, none of it mattered as much as the immediate need to provide shelter and comfort to people in distress. "Billy, help me gather every blanket and dry cloth we can find. We'll need to set up sleeping spaces in the main room and get food prepared for 13 people instead of 5. As she worked to transform their modest home into temporary refuge for stranded travelers, Edith became aware of Jonas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met across the crowded kitchen, he mouthed, "Thank you," with a sincerity that made her chest tighten with emotion. The Henderson family proved to be decent people caught in unfortunate circumstances, husband and wife with 3 young children and an elderly grandmother, traveling to establish a homestead further west. Mrs. Henderson was near exhaustion from fighting the storm, while the children were frightened by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Ma'am," the family patriarch said to Edith as she served him coffee, "we can't thank you enough for taking us in. Most folks would have turned us away rather than crowd their home with strangers." "Nonsense," Edith replied firmly. "Anyone would do the same in such circumstances." But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. Not everyone would have opened their doors to strangers during a crisis. Jonas had made that choice instinctively, just as he'd chosen to help her at the train station weeks ago. It was part of his character of fundamental generosity that had nothing to do with silver deposits or mineral rights. As the storm intensified outside, the house filled with the comfortable sounds of temporary community children playing quiet games, adults sharing stories and concerns, the steady rhythm of domestic activity that made crisis bearable. Edith found herself working alongside Jonas with the easy coordination of a long-married couple, anticipating each other's needs and dividing responsibilities without discussion. "Edith," Jonas said quietly during a brief moment alone, "I saw your trunk. Are you planning to leave?" The direct question forced her to confront feelings she'd been avoiding all day. "I was considering it," she admitted. "The silver discovery changes so much, Jonas. Your position, your options, what people will expect from you. It doesn't change how I feel about you, doesn't it? Can you honestly say that knowing you might be wealthy hasn't affected how you see our relationship?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the careful honesty she'd learned to expect from him. "It's made me wonder if I'm good enough for you," he said finally. "Not because I might have money, but because money brings opportunities I never imagined. You could travel, see places you've only read about, meet people with education and culture that match your own. The thought that you might realize you've been settling for less than you deserve, that keeps me awake at night." His confession revealed fears that mirrored her own, but from the opposite direction. Where she worried about being seen as a fortune hunter, he worried about being abandoned for someone more worthy of her affection. "Jonas Pike," she said firmly, "do you remember what you told me about my age and my dreams when you first read my poetry samplers? That there was nothing foolish about them. Then trust me to know my own heart. I'm not a girl who might be dazzled by wealth or social position. I'm a woman who's lived long enough to recognize genuine worth when I find it." Before Jonas could respond, Charlie burst through the kitchen door with water streaming from his rain slicker. "Boss, we got bigger problems than house guests. The creek's not just over its banks, it's carved itself a whole new channel. The bridge is gone, the road's washed out, and there's a wall of water heading this way that's going to test whether this house is built as solid as your pa claimed." Through the windows, they could see debris-laden water rushing past at a level that seemed impossible. Trees, fence posts, and unidentifiable objects swept by in the muddy torrent that had once been peaceful Willow Creek. "How long do we have?" Jonas asked. "Maybe an hour before it reaches the house. Could be less if that logjam upstream breaks loose." Jonas turned to face the roomful of people who were depending on him for safety, his ranch hands, the stranded Henderson family, and Edith. The weight of responsibility was visible in his expression, but so was the quiet determination that had carried him through 3 decades of frontier life. Charlie, Tom, Billy start moving everything valuable to the upper floor. Food, medical supplies, dry clothes, anything we might need if we're stuck up there for several days. He turned to Mr. Henderson. "Sir, I'm going to ask you and your family to help us prepare for the possibility that this house might be the only dry ground for miles around." As organized chaos took over the house people, carrying supplies upstairs, securing windows, preparing for a siege that might last for days, Edith realized that the letter in her trunk no longer mattered. What mattered was standing beside the man she loved as they faced whatever crisis nature might send their way. The silver mining could wait, the bank's demands could wait, even their own complicated feelings could wait. Right now, they had 13 lives to protect and a home to save from the fury of a Dakota Territory flood. And they would do it together, just as they'd done everything else since that first handshake over his cluttered account, books as partners who'd chosen to face whatever came next side by side. The quilt spread across the floor of the main room told the story of their unlikely partnership in threads and fabric square cut from dress scraps that represented moments in their shared life. Blue cotton from the first curtains Edith had sewn, brown wool from the shirt she'd mended for Jonas after his encounter with barbed wire, soft yellow from the dress she'd made for little Sarah Henderson during their enforced stay. Now, as floodwater lapped at the bottom step of the porch and 13 people crowded into the upper floor of the ranch house, that quilt had become their gathering place for the most important conversation of their lives. "The water's still rising," Tom reported from his position at the upstairs window. "Can't see the barn anymore, and there's a whole tree caught against the side of the house." Jonas nodded grimly, his attention divided between the immediate crisis and the letter Edith had wordlessly handed him an hour earlier, his own handwriting, his own desperate attempt to express feelings he'd never been able to voice directly. The fact that she'd found it, read it, and remained during the flood felt like a miracle he didn't dare interpret. "Mr. Pike," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, bouncing her fussing baby while trying to keep her voice calm for the sake of her older children, "how long might we be here?" "Hard to say, ma'am. Could be a day, could be a week. Depends on how long it takes the water to recede and how much damage there is to the roads and bridges." The practical answer satisfied her immediate concern, but Jonas could see the worry in her eyes. 7 extra people strained their food supplies, their space, and their sanitary arrangements in ways that would become increasingly problematic if the flood lasted more than a few days. "We'll manage," Edith said firmly, settling beside the quilt with her sewing basketone of the few personal possessions she'd insisted on bringing upstairs. "People have weathered worse storms with less preparation." Her matter-of-fact tone steadied everyone's nerves, but Jonas noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she began stitching a new square onto the quilt's edge. The square was cut from green fabric. He didn't recognize something she must have been saving for a special occasion that might never come. "What pattern are you making?" Sarah Henderson asked, scooting closer to watch Edith's careful needlework. "It's called a wedding ring pattern," Edith replied, her eyes briefly meeting Jonas's before returning to her stitching. "Each ring represents a promise kept, a bond that's proven strong enough to last." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Charlie cleared his throat diplomatically and moved to check the western window, while Tom suddenly found urgent business examining the roof for potential leaks. Even the Henderson family seemed to sense undercurrents they couldn't fully understand. A tremendous crash from below made everyone freeze the sound of something large striking the house with enough force to shake the entire structure. Through the floor, they could hear water rushing through what had once been their kitchen, carrying away furniture and memories with equal indifference. "That was the piano," Jonas said quietly, thinking of the small upright instrument his adoptive mother had treasured. "Must have broken loose from its moorings." Edith's hand found his across the quilt, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing despite their audience. "It's just a thing, Jonas. We can replace things." "Can we replace 30 years of building a life?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion as another crash suggested more furniture departing through the windows. "No," Edith said softly, "but we can build a new life together, starting from whatever's left when the water goes down." The word "together" hung in the air between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with flood damage or silver mining rights. Jonas realized that this crisis, being trapped together with nowhere to run, no distractions, no escape from honest conversation, might be exactly what they needed to resolve the emotional complications that had been building for weeks. "Edith," he said, aware that their conversation was hardly private, but unable to wait any longer. "About that letter." "I read it," she interrupted gently. "Every word." "And?" And I want to know if you meant what you wrote, or if you were just trying to convince yourself of something that seemed impossible." Jonas looked around the crowded room at Charlie pretending to study water damage patterns, at the Henderson family politely averting their eyes, at Tom and Billy doing their best to provide privacy in a space where privacy was impossible. These people were his family, chosen rather than born, and their presence during this conversation somehow felt appropriate rather than intrusive. "I meant every word," he said clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I love you, Edith Mayhew, not because you saved my ranch or helped with the books or made the best biscuits in Dakota Territory. I love you because you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. Because you see the man I'm trying to be rather than the one I've been. Because you make me believe that dreams stitched into poetry samplers aren't foolish at all." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she replied, "I love you too, Jonas Pike. I loved you when you stepped forward at that train station and offered protection to a woman everyone else was mocking. I loved you when you admitted you couldn't read poetry but wanted to learn anyway. I love you now, sitting in floodwater with everything we own, probably floating toward the Missouri River. Even with all the complications the silver might bring. Especially with all the complications, money can't change who we are at heart, Jonas. If we remember that, we can handle whatever fortune or misfortune comes our way." The simple declaration felt like a revelation. After weeks of worrying about how external circumstances might affect their relationship, they were acknowledging that love itself was the foundation that would support everything else. "Edith Mayhew," Jonas said, his voice gaining strength and certainty, "will you marry me? Not for convenience or companionship, but because I want to spend whatever years God grants us building something beautiful together." "Yes," she replied without hesitation, "but only if you promise we'll be true partners in everything. The ranch, the silver mining, the decisions that affect our future." "Partners," Jonas agreed, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles that somehow felt more intimate than if they'd been completely alone. Charlie turned from his window position with a grin that creased his weathered face. "About damn time," he announced, causing Mrs. Henderson to shush him automatically before remembering she was a guest with no right to police language. "Charlie's right," Tom added with unusual warmth. "We've been watching you two dance around each other for weeks, too polite to admit what was obvious to everyone else." Young Billy Morrison, who'd been quietly homesick for his family in Missouri, looked up from where he'd been teaching the Henderson children a card game. "Does this mean Miss Edith's gonna be our permanent boss lady now?" "If she'll have us," Jonas replied, "and if we all survive this flood to see tomorrow." As if summoned by his words, an enormous grinding sound rose from below the unmistakable noise of the house's foundation, shifting under pressure from the floodwater. Everyone froze, waiting to see if the structure would hold or if they'd need to find higher ground that simply didn't exist. The house settled with a final, decisive creak, but it held. Whatever Jonas's adoptive father had done when he built this place, he'd built it to last through the worst Dakota Territory could offer. "We're going to be fine," Edith said firmly, returning to her needlework as if floods and marriage proposals were everyday occurrences. "This house has weathered 40 years of storms. It can weather one more." As the green fabric took shape under her careful stitches-a wedding ring pattern that seemed to glow in the lamplight, Jonas realized that the crisis outside had given them something precious. The absolute certainty that they belonged together, regardless of what the future might bring. The piece of raw silver ore lay warm in Edith's palm, its crystalline structure catching lamplight and throwing it back in fragments that danced across the quilt where she'd been working. Jonas had pressed it into her hands during the quiet hours after midnight, when the flood seemed to have reached its peak and the immediate danger had passed. "This came from our land," he'd whispered, careful not to wake the sleeping Henderson children. "Judge Blackwood left it as proof of what we might find if we choose to start mining operations. I want you to design jewelry settings for it rings, maybe a pendant, something that shows the world we're building our future together from what God saw fit to put in our path." Now, as dawn light filtered through windows that showed receding water and emerging patches of muddy ground, Edith studied the silver with the eye of someone who'd spent decades turning raw materials into objects of beauty. The ore would need careful processing to extract pure metal, but even in its rough state, she could see the potential for something extraordinary. "It's beautiful," she said softly, turning the specimen to catch the early sunlight. "Like everything else about this place, it just needs the right hands to bring out its true nature." Jonas smiled at the observation, recognizing the metaphor she was making about their own relationship. They'd both arrived at this partnership as rough ore themselves, weathered by life's disappointments, scarred by previous failures, uncertain of their own worth. But under the right circumstances, with patience and careful attention, they'd discovered something precious in each other. "Mr. Pike?" Charlie's voice from the window carried excitement rather than concern for the first time in 24 hours. "Water's dropping fast now. I can see the top of the barn, and it looks like the structure's sound." Everyone crowded around the windows to assess the damage. The landscape looked like a battlefield, debris scattered everywhere, familiar landmarks altered or destroyed, the creek running in an entirely new channel that skirted the eastern edge of their property. But the essential elements of their life remained. The house had held, the barn was intact, and they could see cattle gathering on higher ground to the north. "We lost some fence line," Tom reported, "and the bridge is definitely gone, but it could have been so much worse." Mrs. Henderson bundled her baby more tightly as she studied the devastation. "How long before the roads are passable again?" "Week, maybe 2, Jonas replied honestly. "But you're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel. We've got supplies enough for everyone if we're careful." The offer was generous, considering their own uncertain circumstances. But Edith noticed how naturally Jonas extended hospitality, even when doing so strained their resources. It was part of his character, the same impulse that had made him help her at the train station, now extended to protecting strangers who'd been caught in nature's violence. "Actually," Mr. Henderson said thoughtfully, "we might be able to help each other more than you realize. I'm a mining engineer by trade, came west looking for opportunities in the territorial silver fields. If what we've been hearing about your mineral rights is true, you might have use for someone with experience in extraction operations." The coincidence felt too perfect to be accidental, and Jonas shot Edith a questioning look. After weeks of struggling with the complexity of potential mining ventures, here was professional expertise delivered by floodwater. "What kind of experience?" Edith asked, her practical mind already working through implications. 15 years in Colorado and Nevada silver mines. Equipment, procurement, worker safety, extraction, efficiency, everything you'd need to know about turning ore deposits into profitable operations without destroying the land in the process. Jonas felt pieces falling into place with almost audible clicks. "Mr. Henderson, if you're serious about staying in the area, we might have the basis for a partnership that could benefit everyone involved." "I'm very serious. My family's looking for a place to settle permanently, and the opportunities in established mining areas are mostly taken by men with more capital than I can raise. But a new operation, starting from scratch with fair partnership terms, that's exactly what I've been hoping to find." As they discussed possibilities, Henderson's expertise combined with Jonas's land rights, Edith's business acumen balancing everyone's interests, a mining operation that could provide employment for the entire community. The morning light revealed more good news outside their windows. "Boss!" Billy Morrison called out from his position watching the north pasture. "The cattle are moving back toward the ranch. Looks like we didn't lose near as many as we feared." The relief in his young voice reflected everyone's feelings. They'd survived the immediate crisis, their essential assets remained intact, and new opportunities were emerging from what had seemed like disaster. Edith returned her attention to the silver ore, her mind now working through practical designs for the jewelry Jonas had requested. Wedding rings seemed most appropriate temple bands that would incorporate small amounts of the raw silver as a reminder of where their partnership had led them. "Jonas," she said, holding up the ore to catch his attention, "I've been thinking about the ring design. What if we made them wide enough to engrave the inside with lines from that Shakespeare sonnet?" Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. It seems fitting for people our age, who've learned that true constancy is rare and precious. You'd want Shakespeare inside our wedding rings? I'd want a promise inside our wedding rings. The poetry is just a beautiful way to express what we both know to be true. Jonas considered this, then nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly the right solution to a complex problem. Edith, I think that's perfect. Poetry and silver from our own land, promises that won't change regardless of what circumstances we face. As the floodwater continued receding and the practical work of recovery began, their small group settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who'd weathered crisis together and emerged stronger for the experience. The Henderson family proved to be exactly the kind of neighbors Jonas had always hoped for, capable, honest, and genuinely interested in building rather than exploiting. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Edith said as the morning progressed toward practical concerns, like food preparation and damage assessment. When should we have the wedding? I know it might seem premature to think about celebrations when we're still dealing with flood damage, but as soon as we can get a preacher here and clean clothes to wear. Jonas interrupted. I've waited 54 years to find the right woman, Edith. I'm not interested in waiting any longer than absolutely necessary. His directness drew laughter from everyone in the room, but Edith could see the sincerity behind his humor. They'd both spent too many years postponing happiness for practical considerations. The flood had reminded them that life was uncertain, opportunities were precious, and love was too valuable to risk losing through excessive caution. In that case, she said, holding up the silver oar one more time, I'd better start working on these rings immediately. A woman should have proper jewelry for her wedding, especially when she's marrying a silver baron. Not a baron yet, Jonas protested with a smile. Still just a cowboy who got lucky enough to find silver under his grazing land and the perfect woman to help him figure out what to do with it. As Edith began sketching ring designs on a piece of paper salvaged from Jonas's water-damaged account books, she realized that the flood had given them something more valuable than silver ore or mining opportunities. It had given them absolute certainty about their feelings for each other, tested under the most difficult circumstances they could imagine. Whatever challenges the future might bring, financial complications, social pressures, the complex demands of running a mining operation, they would face them together, with love that had already proven stronger than doubt, stronger than social convention, and certainly stronger than a Dakota Territory flood. The silver ore glinted in her palm like a promise made tangible, a foundation for building something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The wedding rings caught the afternoon sunlight as they lay nestled in their velvet box, two simple bands crafted from silver, mined on their own land. Inside each ring, etched in Jonas's careful script and Edith's more elegant hand, ran the words that had sustained them through doubt and difficulty. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. 6 months had passed since the flood that changed everything, and Willow Bend Ranch bore little resemblance to the struggling cattle operation Jonas had nearly lost to foreclosure. The silver mine, operated in partnership with Henderson Engineering, provided steady income while employing half the men in the county. Edith's dressmaking business had expanded to include 3 apprentices and customers who traveled from as far as Denver for her skilled work. But the most significant change stood on the ranch house porch, watching the afternoon preparations with the satisfied expression of a woman who'd found her place in the world. Edith Piquet's name still sent a thrill through her heart. Wore a dress of her own creation, deep blue silk that complemented the silver pendant Jonas had given her for their 1-month anniversary. Nervous? Jonas asked, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built specifically so they could watch the sunset together each evening. Excited, Edith corrected, leaning against his shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of people who no longer doubted their welcome in each other's affections. It's not every day we get to host a wedding that might change someone's entire life. Below them, The final preparations were underway for Sarah Henderson's wedding to Billy Morrisona romance that had bloomed during the weeks following the flood, when shared crisis had revealed character and compatibility in equal measure. The young couple had asked Jonas and Edith to host their ceremony, wanting to begin their marriage in the place where they'd learned what true partnership looked like. "Think they'll be as happy as we are?" Jonas asked, his arm tightening around Edith's waist. "Happier, if that's possible. They're starting with advantages we never had: youth, health, and the example of seeing love work out despite obstacles." The wedding guests were already gathering in the meadow behind the ranch house, where chairs borrowed from 3 counties created an outdoor chapel beneath cottonwood trees that had survived the flood. The territorial governor had come to officiate a gesture of respect for Jonas's growing influence in regional mining operations. Judge Blackwood was there, along with neighbors who'd once gossiped about the propriety of Jonas and Edith's arrangement and now sought their advice on everything from land management to marriage counseling. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson approached the porch with the careful smile of someone seeking to repair previously strained relationships. "Mrs. Pike, the decorations are lovely. You've truly transformed this place into something magical." The compliment carried genuine warmth, representing the social acceptance that had followed their marriage and business success. Edith had learned to navigate the politics of being a wealthy rancher's wife while maintaining the direct honesty that had attracted Jonas in the first place. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, though I think the real magic comes from watching 2 people commit to building something beautiful together." As the ceremony began, Jonas and Edith sat together in the front row, their own rings catching sunlight as they listened to Sarah and Billy exchange vows that echoed the promises they'd made to each other during their own simple ceremony months earlier. The territorial preacher spoke of partnership, endurance, and the courage required to build lives together on the frontier. "Marriage is not for the faint of heart," the preacher intoned, his voice carrying across the meadow. "It requires the same qualities that build successful homesteads: patience, determination, and faith that today's hard work will create tomorrow's prosperity." Edith felt Jonas's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of people who'd learned to face everything together. The flood had tested their resolve, the silver mining had complicated their circumstances, and social pressures had challenged their confidence. But they'd emerged from each trial stronger and more certain of their bond. After the ceremony, as guests gathered for the celebration feast Edith had spent weeks planning, she found herself in conversation with other couples who'd found love later in life, inspired by her and Jonas's example to take chances they might previously have considered too risky. "Mrs. Pike," asked Mrs. Henderson, "what advice would you give to people our age who worry they've missed their chance at happiness?" Edith considered the question while watching Jonas demonstrate proper silver ore identification to a group of fascinated guests. "I'd say that the heart doesn't recognize age limits. Love isn't reserved for the young. If anything, we appreciate it more because we understand how rare and precious it truly is. But surely there are practical considerations." "Of course there are, but there are practical considerations at any age. The question is whether you let practical concerns prevent you from taking chances on something wonderful, or whether you'll be brave enough to build something new despite the risks." As evening approached and the celebration moved into the ranch house, Edith found herself standing in the kitchen where so much of their courtship had unfolded. The room had been rebuilt after the flood, expanded to accommodate their larger household and frequent entertaining. But the essence remained, the same: a place where food was prepared with love and conversation flowed as freely as coffee. "Penny for your thoughts," Jonas said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she watched their guests through the window. "I was thinking about that first night you helped me with the poetry sampler. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Here, surrounded by friends, hosting wedding celebrations, and running a successful mining operation?" "No, I honestly never imagined any of this." He paused, his breath warm against her ear. "But I always hoped for something like what we have together. I just never believed it was actually possible." Edith turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. Jonas looked younger now than he had during those desperate weeks before the flood, the worry lines smoothed by security, the defensive wariness replaced by confident contentment. "Do you ever regret taking such a chance on a stranded woman at a train station?" "Every day," Jonas replied solemnly, then smiled at her startled expression. "I regret that it took me 54 years to find the courage to step forward when someone needed help. If I'd learned that lesson earlier, I might have found you sooner. Or we might not have been ready for each other sooner. Maybe we needed all those years of learning how to be alone before we could learn how to be together." As the evening wound down and their guests began the journey home, Jonas and Edith stood on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear Dakota sky. The land around them bore the scars and blessings of the past year-new mining equipment, silhouetted against the horizon, rebuilt fences marking property that now carried their name jointly, cattle grazing in pastures that had been underwater just months before. "What do you think comes next?" Edith asked, settling into the porch swing that had become their nightly ritual. "More of this, if we're lucky. More friends finding love, more young couples starting families, more chances to build something lasting in a place that's always been about new beginnings. And the mining operation will provide for a lot of families while teaching us things about partnership and responsibility we never expected to learn. But it's not the most important thing we've built here." "What is?" Jonas gestured toward the ranch house, where warm light spilled from windows and the sounds of contentment echoed from rooms where people had found shelter, acceptance, and family. "This, a place where people know they're welcome, where love doesn't have age limits, where second chances are as good as first ones if you're brave enough to take them." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Edith felt the weight of the silver pendant Jonas had made for her, a simple design that incorporated elements from her original poetry, sampler, along with silver from their mine. It represented everything they'd built together: practical wisdom tempered by romantic dreams, individual strength enhanced by partnership, and love that had indeed proven constant despite alteration, change, and challenge. 6 months ago, she'd been a stranded woman with nothing but a trunk of fabric scraps and fading dreams. Tonight, she was Mrs. Jonas Pike, co-owner of the most successful mining operation in the territory, mentor to young couples learning about love, and most importantly, partner to a man who'd shown her that dignity, desire, and deep happiness didn't shrink with age or diminish with the passage of time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the continuing adventure of building a life together on the frontier. But tonight, as stars wheeled overhead and the gentle sounds of home surrounded them, Jonas and Edith Pike sat together in perfect contentment, their wedding rings catching starlight and reflecting back the promise that love, once found, could indeed bear out even to the edge of doom. The story that had begun with cruel laughter at a train station had become something beautiful, proof that second chances were as precious as first ones, that dignity and desire knew no age limits, and that the most unlikely partnerships could grow into the strongest foundations for lasting happiness. In the distance, Willow Creek ran in its new channel, forever changed by the flood that had tested everything they'd built together. But like their love, it continued flowing toward the future, carrying with it the promise of renewal, growth, and endless possibilities for those brave enough to follow where it led.